confirm with all of you as soon as I know that we're live according to the YouTube channel. All right, we are live. I'm going to mute myself and you can get started, Jennifer.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're glad that you could join us today. I'm Jennifer Tavares with the Tompkins Chamber, and we were excited to be able to host, along with Tompkins County and several of our local community leaders and partners, a session about the need for state and local aid and federal COVID relief bills. I'm sure many of you are aware that there have been numerous proposals in Washington. We've all been seeing a lot of chatter about this for many weeks. And we're going to try to make a little bit of sense about the current proposals this afternoon and talk a bit about what this means for us locally and why it's important for us to support some additional federal support for state and local governments. There's a lot of ways that this impacts our community. So we're very glad that you could be here. I'm sure everyone's rather familiar at this point with the way that the public health crisis with the coronavirus pandemic has also had widespread and significant economic impacts. And that's at every level. Most of us are feeling this at this point in our households. We certainly, many community organizations are focused on helping residents and helping ensure that people have their basic needs met. But as we look to, area school districts, other services that are funded by local government, human service organizations, and many other aspects of how our business community interacts with local government, funding for various initiatives. Some of it may be grant programs, some of it may be things that are funded through sales tax receipts or even room tax receipts. At every level, all of these different ways that we all work together are being impacted by this pandemic. So it's important that we have an understanding together about where these resources come from and what happens at all those different levels if we don't have the resources that we need. I know that our local governments and our local school districts and many other organizations and certainly businesses have all been making a lot of really difficult decisions about how to move through the next 6 to 12 to 24 months with the resource constraints that we're all experiencing. Together, we all have a shared goal of taking care of our communities, of keeping people safe, of restoring and revitalizing our economy, and helping everyone weather both the public health aspect of this crisis and also the economic aspect of this as well. And so I think we hear a lot about funding for state and local governments, and that's one of the biggest issues that's been talked about, but I think maybe we don't all have a full understanding of how that money flows and why it's such a critical piece of the support that we need from Washington right now. So I know that Dominic from the county is going to be placing some ways that you can reach out to your elected officials and that you can take action. If you want to provide feedback to your elected officials over the next several days about the funding opportunities. And I think best now that I turn it over to Martha Robertson, who is the chair of the county's Intergovernmental Relations Committee and also the county's Budget Committee, because Martha is very keyed into what this all means and what the different funding proposals are. And she's going to take a few minutes to help us sort of understand everything that's on the table right now and help us understand a little bit more about what that means for us locally in Ithaca and Tompkins County. So Martha, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and many thanks to the Chamber for sponsoring this session this afternoon and to the public for joining in and listening. There has been a lot of news about the negotiations in Washington, but usually only a couple of issues maybe get mentioned, and often aid to state and local governments is not on that list. So we did want to take a moment and just kind of describe what the boundaries are between the different proposals. So I'm going to share a few slides. Let's see if I can get this to happen. And bear with me while I make this into a slideshow. Dominic, is this, all right, is this working yet? All right, there we go. I hope that's visible to everybody. Is that okay? I'm not hearing anybody. All right. Let me just say that
Yes, this is correct. You're on.
very good. Thanks so much. So very briefly, talking about the federal response to the coronavirus. We have heard over the months that the White House has basically said that stopping the pandemic is up to states and local governments in many ways, and to determine our own testing programs and our own public health measures, et cetera. And that's what counties have been doing and states have been doing. And we've really been managing and trying to keep our communities safe while handling the economic fallout as well. Maybe people don't notice and don't know in the public that state and local governments can't operate on a deficit model. We have to balance our budgets every year. So, and only the federal government can actually operate on a deficit, borrow money for big investments like this that will be paid back later. So just wanted to mention that the information I'm providing here, most of it is coming from the National Association of Counties, a nonpartisan or bipartisan group of counties across the country, and from the New York State Association of Counties, which includes all 62 New York State counties. Both are decidedly nonpartisan. So they have their analysts that look at all the legislation, and they also have done studies of the economic impact of the virus. So I'm using their numbers. So this projected budget shortfall among all the states is estimated by NACO, the National Association, estimated to be $555 billion this year and next, the budget shortfall because of lost revenue. For counties, for all the counties in the country, $202 billion is estimated to be this shortfall because of the virus. And these are big numbers, but they're very real. When we look at the two bills that are kind of the parameters that they're discussing right now in Washington, the HEROES bill is the bill that was passed in May by the House of Representatives. The HEALS bill is what the Republicans, what Senator McConnell unveiled last week. So I'm just using the convenient red and blue just so you can remember which is which. And we're simply just kind of saying what the facts are between these two bills. We know that a final solution will be somewhere in between these two. I just want to show you the numbers that they're talking about. So in the HEROES bill, there's $500 billion set aside for state governments, for direct aid and flexible aid to state governments. There's no state or local aid. There's no new state or local aid in the HEALS bill, in McConnell's bill. So then you see for counties, $187.5 billion in the HEROES bill directly to counties, and for all other local municipalities, another $187.5 billion in the HEROES bill. When we look at the numbers that will come to Tompkins County in the HEROES bill, and this is the only slide here that came from one of the parties. This comes from the speaker because that's their bill. That according to the HEROES Act, Tompkins County would receive $38.3 million directly this year. The city and town of Ithaca would receive $32.6 million, and all other localities in Tompkins County would get some aid based on population. I wanted to mention also that there has been previous funding to state and local governments under the CARES Act. However, the municipalities that got money had to be 500,000 in population or greater. So for example, Erie County got some funding. Most of us got no funding under the CARES Act. Both new bills would increase flexibility for how that money would get spent. But there's some pretty significant differences in how they'd be allowed to spend that money. We are looking at a timeline that is serious. This is crunch time. August 7th, the Senate is scheduled to go on recess until September 8th. All the pundits believe that if nothing is passed by August 7th, this week, they don't really expect anything to happen at all. So whether that's true, I don't know. Nobody knows. But we would like the public to join us in calling on Congress, the Senate, the House, and the White House to make a compromise, to find a way, to find a middle. You've got a $3 trillion total price tag for the HEROES Act, a $1 trillion total price tag for the HEALS Act. There's a middle in there that Congress should be able to get to along with the White House. So you can see on the screen here, you can get to any senator or congressperson at this number, 202-224-3121. If you know somebody in another state, might encourage them to use that number and call. For Senate Leader McConnell and for the White House, I understand that their phone lines are switched off. So that's why I've got these web forms where you can go for to put in your comments, just asking the federal government to recognize that there's no, state lines are not going to keep the economic fallout in one state or another. We're all in this together. Same as the virus is affecting all of us. We really need to all be Americans here and work together on this. So that's a quick summary of what's in these two bills. As far as state and local aid, there are many, many other provisions that I don't have time to go into here, but if anybody's interested, give me a call. So that's the quick rundown, and I will take my screen off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. So we certainly will have some time for questions later if folks want to get a little bit deeper into anything that you presented there, or any of the other proposals that have come along the way. Now we're going to get into how things are impacting specific industries. And we want to start actually with Dr. Jeffrey Madison from TST BOCES. Jeff, I know you have been very involved in conversations about how this is impacting local school districts, and also you're very involved at the statewide level with your industry associations and boards, and you're in regular contact with Albany. So you have some important perspective to bring to this conversation. Can you talk to us? Well, first you can share whatever it is you want to share when I turn to you, but then the first question I was going to ask was if you could share how this is going to have impacts for local school districts, and perhaps focus a bit on the difference between what the experience might be for urban versus rural school districts in that.
Actually, when you look at urban and rural with the federal pot of money, since it's tied to poverty, in many ways it affects them in a very similar way when money is withheld or isn't coming down the pike the way it should be, or it's diverted on the way to schools. It would impact them equally. So as far as the money coming in, it creates a challenge, obviously, with a larger school district with more of a population to take care of during a pandemic, especially when you're wanting to reopen a school. Additional funds would be needed beyond what a regular title allocation would be coming from the federal government. One piece that occurred during this most recent CARES funding in the middle of the spring at the very beginning was it coincided with the New York State budget, where school districts were level funded, but they were only level funded by using CARES Act money to backfill a cut. So they're level funded with a backfill, and then a month later we discovered that the way the CARES funding was going to be interpreted was the normal share that school districts make with privates and non-publics. And so that number ended up being each school district actually is receiving a cut this year, regardless of the backfill from the CARES Act. So in the original state aid run, it showed level funding, but they actually are getting less than was in that state aid fund because the interpretation of how that's going to be distributed. So there you have a level funding of education with increasing costs in a pandemic. Also with the expectation now to reopen where there's increasing costs of keeping our schools safe, reorganizing some things, having personal protective equipment, working on a schedule that allows for social distancing and the transportation, which that costs extra money. That doesn't come from your regular school budget. And we do know that in those bills, there would be money for reopening, but we don't even know what those details are. Is that only tied to 100% fully reopening, which is really challenging for all of our school districts because of the Department of Health regulations and the CDC guidance? So you've probably seen in reopening plans, there's a lot of staggering for how the reopening is happening and who reopens full time at what age level and what days, and the kind of creative scheduling they're trying to do in our school districts to get young people educated, at least in part in person. So these are real challenging things coming from just our current trying to reopen a pandemic, and then you add on to it the level of funding of our school districts in the first place, and you've really got a real challenge ahead for all of our communities as they try to figure out how they're going to fund schools and how they're going to execute a school year.
Well, I think you just answered the questions that I have for you right now, but I'm sure we'll circle back to you later. And if there's anything else you wanted to share right now before we move on, I thought I would just check in.
Well, I guess I did get a little bit comprehensive there, and that's fine.
That's okay.
But this is what we're neck deep into the entire time. And really, if the additional funding doesn't come in to help support the state budget, at least in part, what happens is the further the school year goes on, the harder it's going to be, because we've got enough to open, but we can't sustain the opening because we're going to have to continue to go through materials, including personal protective equipment that we're required to provide when someone doesn't have them, whether it's a staff member or for a student. We will run out, and we're going to need some sustained funding to make sure that we can keep the school days running.
Thanks so much for that, Jeff. It is unimaginably difficult. And I know, in addition to just all those basic needs that you're talking about and the money issues, I know this is a very complex and sort of very stressful thing for everyone involved to be thinking about. So I know we've all been thinking a whole lot about educators and administrators and parents and students as we all try to navigate this together. Sort of keeping on the education topic for now, I actually want to move over to Deb Mullins, is Chief of Staff for Dr. Arinthia Montague. And I'm sure many of you know Deb, and she has a lot of different hats that she wears. So I'm going to let her, choose to expand her comments into some different areas if she needs to do that, because she also does represent the city of Ithaca and spends an awful lot of time in local government and in the budget concerns at the city level as well. But if we could talk first about TC3, and again, Deb, feel free to expand as an intro and whatever you would like to share. And then tell us about how specifically TC3 is funded with tuition versus state and local aid, and how you expect the current budget concerns to impact TC3.
Great, thank you. And again, Dr. Montague sends her regrets. We're all in the minute of last minute schedule changes here. So unfortunately, she is with us here in spirit. So just to talk very quickly, and I'd love to take anyone's questions that might have it. Anyone that's been following the news knows that both levels of education, K-12 and higher education, have really been embroiled in this just epic planning. Basically, we're planning for the unknown. We're not only planning for a pandemic and the potential impacts and being extremely concerned about what level of reopening is appropriate, what level of testing is appropriate to maintain the safety of our students, faculty, and staff, and also our community. On top of that, we are now in the midst of also, at least at TC3, planning for a financial crisis at the same time. I mean, the potential impact of what the cuts from the state will do to us is potentially devastating for the institution. I don't have to tell all of you, but maybe some of the people watching, we see our institution as crucial to the economic recovery of our community. We have options for training people that might be unemployed. We have good partnerships with our workforce development organizations. We are crucial for cost savings for families that might not now be able to send a student to a four-year institution. We have a flexible mix of online, part-time, evening, etc. classes for people whose lives might just be tossed upside down right now. So the reason for us to be in this community and have all of these options in terms of education is more crucial with everybody being in just this place of uncertainty. So we're fairly lean already. If you were to take a look at our numbers, really the only place that we might be able to make some modifications would be in our staffing. And if we reduce staffing, then we're reducing programs and services. We really provide comprehensive wraparound services for every single student. We have mental health services, we have a pantry, we have really one-on-one counseling and academic support to make sure that all the students that go, journey through our institution have what they need in order to be successful. So for us, a reduction, we're really looking at what could we do without at this point, and we're pretty lean. So your question about how we're funded, the original model for community colleges was supposed to be a third, with a third coming from the state, a third coming from tuition, and then a third coming from sponsor counties. We're a little off that right now, and the trend that we've been seeing, and it's not just specifically with the pandemic upon us, it's been inching up over the years. Our tuition, which again is against that original spirit of a community college, we are now at about 38% of our revenue is coming from our tuition. We would really like that to be lower. We did just raise our tuition by 5% as well for the coming year. Just we felt that there was really no other way to get at even coming close to creating a balanced budget without raising our tuition. Our counties have been very supportive and generous, and we've been in ongoing conversations with them. The problem is our counties are in the same financial hardship as our institution might be if there's potential state aid that is going to be cut. So we can't very well go back to our sponsor counties and say we need more, because they are also looking to see in what ways they're going to be impacted by potential reductions. That's all being driven by the fact that our economy is very different than we thought it would be at this time, with much of the revenue stream that we all anticipate coming in just not being there. The other issue for us is that all of this uncertainty has created a little bit of an enrollment crisis for us as well. Normal times tell you that in an economy that is bad, community college enrollment goes up. This is not a normal economic downturn. This is something long and sustained and unexpected that we just don't know what the potential impact of this will be. And with everyone in that level of limbo, we're not certain what will happen once we get closer to our start date for classes. Right now, we're only at about 58% of our target for fall enrollment. That means we have about 4 weeks to find 40% of the students that we planned on coming to campus. We think the majority of them are either waiting to see what happens with families or K-12 or a 4-year or their employment situation before they make the final decision to commit to coming to school. So I think that got at least your initial questions. It will be very crucial for us to not only receive additional support in order to cover testing and PPE and all of those things that we feel we need in order to open safely, but just the uncertainty of enrollment and the amount of money that the state has already reduced us by for this year. If we were to receive any additional reductions, similarly to what Jeff said, they are also looking at the money we did receive from the CARES Act, then that being deducted from aid payment coming down the road. So they're sort of, well, we can reduce your state aid because you already got X amount in federal funding. So that will be significantly impactful if our state aid is reduced any more than it already was for the upcoming school year. So I will leave it there and look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thanks very much, Deb. So now we're gonna change topics a little bit and think about all the human services impacts and our local nonprofit community. I'm sure most of you are aware that nonprofits have a lot of different funding sources regularly. They have a lot of private donations, but they also rely heavily on grant investments and partnerships with local governments and special programs in conjunction with both the state and the federal government. So there's, existing programs potentially at risk. There may be also new opportunities coming down the pike, but we wanted to hear from Kathy Schlather, who is the Executive Director of the Human Services Coalition, who I know really has her ear to the ground with our nonprofit service providers and our human services organizations to understand, how all of this ties together and how our local nonprofits are being impacted. So Kathy, did you want to share a little bit of your perspective, and then I can follow up with a question?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. There are a number of things going on in nonprofits. As you know, when everybody had to kind of stop providing services the way that they were used to providing services or keeping their doors open, that did not mean that people didn't need services. So they have had to be clever and quick in figuring out how to provide those services, while at the same time not really having a good idea of what was going to happen to their funding. There were a couple of deadlines when the governor could have talked about what was going to happen with state funding. He has actually chosen to not do that at any particular time. So a lot of nonprofits are now heading into the fall not knowing exactly what cuts will be coming from state funding. And also a number of nonprofits have been not knowing what they're going to do, have been continuing providing services, but not getting paid with state funding. If some contracts are being honored, it's being honored at somewhere 80, 75 or 80% of what the contract amount was for. So it's been very difficult for nonprofits to plan. There has been a reduction in county and city funding going to nonprofits, and most of them know that if this year looks bad, it's not going to be any prettier next year. They're trying to plan for a future that they know is probably going to increase considerably requests for services. The other thing that a number of nonprofits were able to avail themselves of the PPP funding, but that is running out. They were able to furlough some staff because there were increased unemployment benefits. We don't know what's going to happen to that. It has run out. We don't know if that's going to be re-upped. And so they are trying to bring staff back with very little guarantee that they will have the funding from either the state or federal government to actually be able to buy, to hire staff back. And for nonprofits, about 80 to 90% of their budget is actually staff. So when staff, there's no money for staff, there's no money for program. So it's been very difficult for them to kind of proceed not knowing knowing that the future is not going to be pretty, but not really understanding how ugly it's going to get. So.
Could you, thanks for that, Kathy. Could we talk a little bit more deeply about, are there certain types of nonprofits that you think are being more disproportionately impacted than others? Are there some that rely more on state or local government funding than others? And, just any other perspective there so folks might know what to expect in terms of, which areas the programs and services might be most impacted. And I guess I do just want to take this opportunity to mention, obviously we have a very generous community, and there've been several really wonderful recent examples where private donors have stepped up to fill in the gaps in some of these areas where either state or local funding were not available to open certain programs or to help sustain certain nonprofits. So that's been really wonderful. And I know we all appreciate the generosity of those many community members, but just like governments might run out of piggy banks to crack open, so might some of those wonderful local folks. So just a little bit more perspective on, are there certain areas that we should be more concerned about than others?
Yeah, I want to reiterate that local funders got together as a group and have been meeting weekly, twice weekly, actually, since March, to try to meet some of the increased needs that agencies have had and their clients because of COVID, but to really look at even future needs of agencies and where they may be going. But you're absolutely right. They cannot, there's just not enough funding to close every gap they're going to find in funding. As far as, the bigger the agency, the probably more likely it is to get state or federal funding. A lot of agencies, which we would think of as essential services, things like legal services or domestic violence services, literacy, services for people with disabilities, housing, transportation. Those are the ones that tend to, and other, mental health services, daycare, child development services. They're the ones that tend to rely more heavily on state and federal funding. And they're the ones who will probably be impacted the greatest if there's cuts at the state and federal level. Of course, we don't know. We don't know if it's going to be across the board funding cuts. We don't know if it's going to be how reimbursement is going to come. And the other thing that a lot of the agencies have is contracts that run through county departments. And there's no indication of what's going to happen to those contracts. I mean, there's been indication that some funding from the state's going to be cut that is funded, say, services through the Child Development Council or other services, that it's not going to be just impacted 20%. It's going to be cut totally. So I think at this point, certainly those agencies that have larger fund balances or will be able to weather this a little better. But there are two factors. There are agencies like a lot of the daycare centers, pretty much, it's all been kind of up in the air to them. They don't know how many people will be coming back, how many people will be sending their children, and they depend heavily on tuition from parents. So it's been very hard on the daycare centers. There are other agencies that depend, like I said, on reimbursements from the state for services rendered, and are not getting the payments and not getting them in a timely manner. I think you're going to see cutbacks in almost all services. The other thing is there is a lot of uncertainty, and we have a very generous community. People have been amazing at stepping forward, but a lot of the smaller agencies depend on local funding to keep going from the community, and there's actually no way of knowing whether that's going to continue. They depend on end of the year funding. People have been very generous up to front, but are people going to be able to continue to do that? So there are really a lot of uncertainties around what services are going to be able to continue and which ones will be cut back.
Thanks for that, Kathy. It is, enormously complex, and I think there's no type of agency or organization or business or person, for that matter, that's not being impacted. So I just think it is good to hear and to more deeply understand those different perspectives. I just thought I would share a little bit. I think people don't think a whole lot about the business side of things sometimes. I personally sort of appreciated and was, I think, a little bit surprised. Very early in this, I think people realized how big the impact would be from, sort of pausing all the business activity. I was starting to hear things discussed in public meetings that I just hadn't really heard come out of people's mouths in the past, in terms of, really understanding, that's how that sales tax revenue impacts everything else that we choose to do at the local government level. An example with the Chamber and Convention and Visitors Bureau, Chamber is largely funded through membership investments, event and program revenue. We have some grant programs that we administer. We've done state grant programs in the past, and also we have a federal program that we're a party to right now. And certainly when if you have expended those services, or if you have a contract for some of those services, and then that payer, the government, whichever level of government it is, tells you that they aren't going to be able to pay you. And unfortunately, some of these impacts are not felt until a couple quarters after you may have already rendered those services. So I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand how, when people are doing grant administration or they're providing services at the nonprofit level, they often render those services and then they draw that money down later on and wait for the government to reimburse them for that work that they've already done. They may have already spent payroll, they've spent benefits, they've pushed money out the door and on the street, and then they wait for the government to reimburse them. And so it's extremely painful when you've done your contracted obligation, and then you're waiting for your reimbursement for last quarter, 2 quarters ago, and only then do you hear that actually, in fact, that money might not be coming. And so, that certainly is something that we're experiencing, and I know a lot of other agencies in Tompkins County are also going through that. One thing that's been extra complicated for us that I think a lot of people aren't aware of is that we're a 501c6 organization, not a 501c3 organization. And for whatever reason, in all the prior rounds of funding, 501c6 organizations were excluded from being able to access PPP, which would be a source of funding to help make payroll, pay benefits, pay other operating costs for a period of time. A lot of businesses have accessed that funding. A lot of nonprofit organizations have as well, but certain types of nonprofits were excluded, and that included us. So in this next round, we've been advocating for many months, as have every industry association we're members of, that we need to also help 501c6 organizations, and that's a lot of everyone's professional industry associations, any membership association that you might be a member of, destination management organizations, chambers of commerce, even economic development organizations. A lot of those entities that actually provide really critical services to local communities and regions and states across the country have all thus far been excluded from actually getting that support from Washington. And so that's something we would really like to see make it through this round this week. It's been promising. It's come through the House, and it's also in some of the most recent information we've seen out of the Senate. But until it's a done deal, until something's signed, we're not going to necessarily hold our breath too much. Or I guess we are holding our breath, actually, quite a lot. But I think a lot of people don't understand the extent to which local and state and federal governments also partner with businesses to make a lot of investments. A lot of people don't understand how economic development works. That's totally fine, but there's a lot of grant programs, a lot of tax credit programs, tax abatement programs, a lot of partnerships where really important critical infrastructure is built in our communities, housing projects are built in our communities, and actual economic development investments happen in communities all across this country, and that includes ours. And so that's just another place where potential, pullbacks in funding, or if state and federal governments don't feel that they can make those investments, or if they don't have the revenue that they need to make those investments, those are things that we will see even more down the road. I'm sure many people are aware that there's been rounds of funding every year coming out of New York State for economic development at the local level. And that's another piece where it's not only for private, for-profit job creating projects necessarily, it's all types of investments that have been funded through that round of funding. And so there's just a lot up in the air right now. The other piece I think that's important to just focus on is workforce development. Deb, I think, mentioned that earlier. There's a large effort to get more funding on the table for workforce development. There's going to be a big need for additional job training grants, additional types of training investments, additional support for people to go back to school or to get additional skills upgrades if they've lost their employment, their existing employment, or they want to take advantage of what might be a very different looking economy in a couple of years, with people needing access to more technology, more understanding about different tools and technologies, and potentially with a higher percentage of remote workforce in the future. So there's going to be need to be a lot of investment in workforce development as well. And thus far, at least as far as our workforce development director is concerned, Natalie Bronowski, we're not seeing the level of investment that we're hoping for that will help support our community in the long term. So that's another thing that we're all advocating for that I think is important to highlight. I thought we could take a minute to, we have gotten a few questions in actually, and I did also want to let each Martha and Deb spend just another moment touching on the specific budget impacts at the county and the city. Just a few more words about what you're seeing and your key concerns moving forward. So Martha, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Boy, I agree with everybody here. When we look at the county budget, and County Administrator Jason Molino, along with the staff, department heads, have done a tremendous amount of work. We've already trimmed our 2020 expenses by 5.8 million in cuts, 5.8 million already, and that was to try to get control over what the gap is going to be. But we see, for example, our sales tax has gone down by 33% the last couple of quarters. Our casino revenue has just disappeared. And I know Jennifer has talked about the room tax revenue, which certainly supports key parts of our community as well. Huge hits there. We are looking at this point, probably a deficit for 2021 of between $12.5 and $16.5 million. If we had to make that up entirely, we wouldn't make this up entirely with property tax increases, but if, just so you know what that would be, that would be more than 24 to 31% tax levy increase. That's kind of the scale we're talking about. And that's even before we know what kind of cuts we might get from the state of New York. So we are working very hard to bring those numbers down. We do have some reserves, but it's irresponsible to use reserves to replace, reserves that don't refresh, to use that to replace staff cuts. So as Kathy knows, we've already cut the nonprofit agencies, and we are really worried about what's needed at TC3, et cetera. So this is just a situation where, as I said earlier, the federal government really can step in and solve a lot of these problems. It's almost cost-free to do borrowing right now, and that's what we need the federal government to do, to prop us all up while we get through this pandemic.
Thanks for that, Martha. Deb, anything you want to share from the city perspective?
Just really, ditto to everything Martha just said. Exactly the same financial impacts of the county are going to be the same for the city. Been chairing the budget process for several years now. We thought we went through some tough budgets. This one's going to be just unimaginable. Trying to figure out how to come out of 2020. We were able to furlough a significant number of city staff, which allowed us to squirrel some money away so that 2020 isn't as bad as it might potentially be. 2021, we don't even know how to approach 2021 at this point. One thing that Martha did not say, which is the elephant in the room that we cannot stop talking about, is the impact of the colleges and the economy of the city. We are all trying to find the right balance between what is safe for the community. The flip side to that is what happens to our economy when we don't have those normal consumers in it and using restaurants and purchasing, and even commuters coming in and out of town and purchasing gas and eating out. It has a very, very big impact. And we're pretty concerned about what the city's economy will look like without the normal daily traffic. We're still pretty concerned, even if all the higher ed institutions are able to open up in some fashion. We know that there is going to be a reduction in what the normal commerce would be. So we have seen several businesses in College Town have already closed, probably directly related to the fact that they did not have that ongoing income from that natural population up in College Town. So again, Martha is right on the money with what potentially the tax increase could look like if we were to try to close these financial gaps by raising taxes, and that's just not possible. Amazingly generous donors were why we were able to get some of our youth services back up and running for the summer, but that is also very unsustainable. We cannot rely on that in the future in order to keep just our basic quality of life services. So it'll be an interesting 2021 budget development for this year.
Thanks, Deb, for that perspective. And I do think it's, so much of the community conversation right now is around sort of trying to weigh the public health versus the economic concerns. And I see those things as very intertwined. And I think we all are in 100% agreement that we must first address the public health concerns and that we must be as safe as possible about everything that we're all doing right now. But I think that the potential immediate and long-term impacts of the economic issues are just as serious from a health perspective, from a community health, from in some cases a personal health perspective. And obviously we all want to support the community in navigating this as well as we can. We have gotten a couple of questions in, and so one of them that I wanted to share, and I think anyone who wants to answer this could do that. The Senate this last week failed to renew the $600 unemployment supplement. I know we're all aware about this, aware of this. A lot of people are losing confidence with all the back and forth and discussion on not just that, but the whole conversation that the federal government is not going to, do what we need them to do and isn't prioritizing local needs. So question that came in is essentially, what's the plan if they don't fund extended unemployment insurance benefits? What are the alternative solutions or any local solutions that we can and should be looking at if the federal government doesn't come through the way that everyone's asking them to?
I guess I'll take a stab at that. I think people should, for one thing, have I hate to say, be optimistic, but have a little bit of confidence that this is how the sausage gets made, and that it looks like nothing's happening, and then all of a sudden something happens. So I would say as long as they're talking, we can be hopeful. I know that Senator Schumer, of course, is in a fantastic position. He's one of the leaders, and he's certainly feeling very, very strong about aid to state and local governments. It's one of his top issues. On the unemployment as well, he's very strong on that. So is Congressman Tom Reed. But I think we do have some local support mechanisms. We have a housing, a rental assistance program that INHS is operating through for the city and for county residents. So people should call INHS to look into that if you need help paying your rent. And we will maintain a strong safety net one way or another. I know that that's in partnership with Kathy and all her agencies. And we will be determined to prioritize the safety net as we go forward.
And, anyone can correct my read on this, but I think the fact that the counter proposal to the $600 specifically, since that was in the question, was a $200 weekly supplement. I think there's reason to think that they're likely to reach some kind of agreement this week. I think, as you started in the beginning, Martha, if it doesn't happen this week, it's going to be quite a long time. We've had very regular calls with Congressman Reed as well, and he seemed to think that something was going to get through sometime this week. I think when we hear these numbers, right, there's a lot of people that want the $600 to continue. We heard the other folks come in with a counter proposal at $200. Who knows? It's very likely that something in between those numbers might end up being what we see. And I think the same thing goes back to your slides at the beginning. There's some middle ground between the big numbers and the zero, right? And that's very much more likely we're going to end up somewhere in the middle. I think as you're seeing the proposals and hearing the rhetoric, it's a little bit harder to parse that out, right? But that's like what you just said, the sausage being made, and very likely that It's just part of the negotiation process, as difficult as that might feel for everyone right now. It's obviously an atypical time to be going through a process like that.
That's why it really is important for legislators in the White House to hear from normal Americans, not just other elected officials, but to hear from the people who are directly affected. So I do hope that's why we decided to hold this roundtable, and I hope people will pick up the phone or send that email this week.
So another question that we got in, and anyone who wants to speak to this, would just be to talk a bit more about whether there's any creative ideas or anything that we may have more local control over that would help us in terms of supporting our economy and putting us in a better position to recover in the future. Is there anything that anyone's heard as far as ideas or policy proposals you'd like to see pursued that would maybe help us be more resilient ourselves without as much outside intervention?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but one of the things that has been encouraging is the level of ongoing collaboration and cooperation that we have seen among similar organizations. You know, Cornell, Ithaca College, and TC3 have never worked together like they've worked together now on this notion of we're all in it together. This morning at our higher ed call, we've now invited K-12. So we had some friends on this morning. Jeff and Lavelle had joined us. We're really starting to look collectively at what this could look like. Initially, it was just sharing thoughts and resources on the pandemic crisis and what that looked like. We are going to have to continue these conversations in order to figure out if there's any options for sharing resources like that. Similarly, the county and the city have been talking on, are there new or renewed ideas or interest in sharing any services, things like DPW or admin or IT or some of those things. All of those ideas that were pie in the sky before are going to have to get put back on the table right now. And we are all going to have a tough 2021 budget. And one of the nice things is this, with these additional conversations going on in the community about allocating resources and what should be prioritized, we are able to also bring the nonprofits to the table with really balancing out what are we asking people to do, what do we feel quality of life is in our community, and what do we need to maintain and what can we live without. So we're all going to be having that conversation. We're very open to any suggestions that anyone has at this point. Innovation is how we're going to get out of this, I think.
Yeah, if I could just stop at one of the, when I was mentioning the local funders meet on a regular basis, a group of them, they all funded consultants to work with agencies to really look at how they can get through the next 18 months to 2 years, and everything from, you know, what programs, you know, are necessary to the mission, to are there things they could do by sources with other agencies, to really take a comprehensive look at their organization so they can plan to get through this. So I think that's kind of innovative approach, not to just deal with what we're doing right at this moment, but what we're going to need to do 6 months from now or 12 months from now is going to help a lot in getting people through this.
Jennifer, if I can just pile on that particular partnership perspective, you may recall we haven't had students in school in person for almost 6 months, and we're still feeding kids. And that comes from the partnership that was created the entire region between all the food banks and all the people that were doing food work and the schools, creating from scratch a delivery system that we sustained up until this day. And we know that we've got new partnerships and new people we know to call on. And the same thing happened. We had to submit childcare plans that the schools had to then communicate to our families. Is we found who are our partners, we got together and we had regular conversations. So we just need to make sure that we stay connected. If we don't stay connected, this is going to happen again, and we won't be as I think ready for whatever can come down the pike. We need to keep connected. We can build in all the efficiencies now, save the time, the money, and the energy, and create something really spectacular now so that later we can sustain through more challenging times, which could still be ahead.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Yes, it really is a time to take a step back and to prioritize and to really think about what new partnerships can be created and what efficiencies can be gained and how can we all be more resilient as organizations and as local governments and schools, et cetera. I saw another question come in from our friend Jean McFeeters, and something I've actually seen others wondering about online as well. There's a lot of housing available right now that we wouldn't normally have available in this community. And I know you've all been involved in one way or another in trying to address our community's housing concerns. So there's a question as to whether there's any role for local government to try to help encourage property owners and landlords to consider making housing available to local community members and renters at maybe a lower than typical cost to support the need for more affordable housing in the interim, and also to help them generate the revenue that they might need over the next period of time, while perhaps we don't have quite as many students in town as we normally would. Does anyone want to answer that, or do we want to just keep that as an idea and see what kind of conversations emerge from there? Martha?
Yeah, I thought you were aiming at me. I guess I'll jump in that. I think things are that's a little premature. Things are so unsettled. We still don't even really know which students are coming back, how many are coming back. We're also trying to understand that just like the schools have to double or triple in the amount of space the same number of people take up, so do our residents. And we may find that that some of the density of housing will need to, people will need to spread out and have fewer people in a unit. There's a lot that remains to be seen. And I know that landlords are also struggling too. It's not like their expenses don't go away. I know that the federal prohibition on evictions is considered. It looks like they may extend that. That'd be great news. But this is one of those slinkies. You pull on it in one place and it affects everybody else. So we'll certainly be watching that and see what we can do, if there's anything that we can do to help. Don't know if that was an answer, but it's a little, let's wait and see how things settle out.
I think that was a fine answer. I think unless anyone has any other final parting words, I think Martha, maybe you were gonna one more time remind us of where we need to go or who we need to call if we have some information to share on this topic. So I'll let you do that. And I just want to thank you all for your time today. We appreciated having input from Dr. Jeffrey Madison from TSD BOCES, Kathy Schlather, Executive Director of the Human Services Coalition, Deb Molinoff on behalf of TC3, and I managed to get her to say a few words about the city as well, so thanks for that, and Martha Robertson from the Tompkins County Legislature. So Martha?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to all the panelists. And Jennifer, you've been a wonderful partner, and it really is a special community where we feel like people can pick up the phone and get a group together and work on these kind of problems. I would want to mention also Cayuga Medical Center, which has really been a key partner since the beginning of this in developing a great testing protocol and working hard with our public health department. So the phone number, 202-224-3161. That's the Capitol Switchboard, 202-224-3161. Oh, did I say 61? I think it's 3121. Did I mess that up? 202-224-3121. And
Great job.
who you want to speak to. You can speak to Tom Reed, Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand. I would urge you to call McConnell's office and go online to Senator McConnell and to the White House and fill out their web forms about what your comment is on this. We are all Americans in this. As I said, the virus doesn't recognize state boundaries, and neither does the economic damage. We need to really be pulling together as one country. And I know this community can help us get that word to Washington. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks. Take care.